The moment I held the envelope in my hands, I felt a strange mix of dread and curiosity swirling inside me. It wasn't just any letter. It was the will, my mother's final words, her last instructions to the people she had loved, or at least the people she had chosen to remember. I sat in the small, dimly lit study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust, trying to steady my hands. I had expected tears, perhaps even a pang of nostalgia, but instead I felt a cold, sinking sensation that made my stomach tighten. My mother had always been distant in ways that I could never fully understand, and now, even in death, she seemed determined to surprise me. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant, precise, almost as if every word had been measured to ensure its impact. I began to read, my eyes scanning each line, my heart pacing faster with every sentence. The initial paragraphs were typical, almost mundane. Small bequests to distant relatives, some money to charity, her favorite books to the local library. I nodded absently, trying to anticipate what came next, but I was unprepared for the words that followed. When I read my own name, my chest tightened. The amount, the gesture, the explanation. It wasn't just insulting. It felt like a deliberate judgment, a final verdict on my worth in her eyes. I sat there for a long moment, my fingers gripping the edges of the paper as though holding on might somehow change the contents. It was as if the air around me had thickened, pressing in, forcing me to face a truth I had been avoiding all my life. My mother's love had always been conditional, measured, and perhaps never truly extended to me in the way I had needed. The inheritance she left me was paltry, almost laughable compared to what she had given to my cousins, some of whom had barely spoken to her in years. I felt a surge of anger, but it was tangled with grief, a bitter mixture that made my chest ache. I thought back to my childhood, to the countless times I had sought her approval and found it withheld. The silent criticisms, the comparisons to other children, the cold tone in her voice whenever I spoke, the way she seemed to expect perfection yet never offered affection. And now, this final act, felt like the culmination of a lifetime of subtle rejections. I wasn't just disappointed. I felt invisible, belittled, and almost mocked by the very person who had brought me into this world. But even as the anger flared, a strange clarity began to settle over me. For the first time, I could see my mother in a way I hadn't before, not as the nurturing parent I had wished for, not as the woman whose approval I had craved, but as a human being with her own flaws, biases, and limitations. She had lived her life according to her own rules, and I had spent too long measuring myself by standards she set but never truly shared. The will, insulting as it was, became a mirror reflecting not just her judgment but also my own unresolved need for validation. I put the paper down and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet of the study envelop me. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a reminder that life moved on, indifferent to the griefs and slights of the past. I realized that this inheritance, this insult, could either define me or push me to redefine myself. I could let it crush me, allow it to dictate my worth, or I could rise above it, reclaiming my life from the shadows of a mother who never fully understood me. The thought was empowering yet terrifying. I had spent years chasing her approval, trying to fit into a mold that was never mine, sacrificing parts of myself to meet expectations that were impossibly high and painfully inconsistent. And now, in her absence, I faced a choice: continue to dwell on the sting of her final act, or use it as a catalyst to finally live for myself. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, yet simultaneously, a vast horizon of possibility seemed to stretch out before me, uncharted and wide. I picked up the paper again, reading her words one last time, not to seek validation, but to understand them, to digest them fully. Each phrase, each decision, each seemingly petty bequest carried a message she perhaps never intended to deliver explicitly but had delivered anyway. That my worth, in her eyes, had always been measured by external standards, by what I could provide, by what I could achieve, by how I fit into her version of a family. The insult, sharp and undeniable, became a symbol of everything I had endured, everything I had internalized, and everything I was now determined to transcend. I knew then that this was the turning point. The moment where grief, anger, and disappointment converged into clarity. The moment where I would decide not to be diminished by the final judgments of someone who could no longer impact my life. The will had been insulting, yes, but it had also offered an unintentional gift. The freedom to redefine my relationship with my past, to reclaim the narrative of my life, to step into a future unshackled by the conditional love of a mother who had never truly seen me. As I folded the paper and set it aside, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me: sadness, anger, liberation, and an unexpected surge of determination. I realized that the inheritance I truly needed was not the money, the objects, or the material items, but the understanding that my value was not defined by her standards or her approval. I was worthy simply because I existed, because I had endured, because I had learned, and because I was capable of defining my own life. I left the study and walked to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The city stretched endlessly, full of possibilities I had ignored for too long. And in that moment I made a silent vow. I would not let a lifetime of subtle neglect, of quiet criticisms, or a final insulting gesture dictate my path. I would rise above it, not for her, not for anyone else, but for myself. And perhaps in doing so I would finally understand what it truly meant to live freely, fully, and authentically. A knock at the door startled me, breaking my reverie. I turned slowly, my heart skipping a beat. The figure in the doorway was someone I hadn't expected, someone whose presence promised answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. And yet, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The morning after reading the will, I couldn't shake the taste of bitterness that lingered in my mouth. It wasn't just about the money or the items she left me, or more accurately, didn't leave me. It was about the realization that her final act had been another lesson in diminishment, a reminder of every time she had deemed me insufficient. I moved through the house mechanically, making tea, opening the blinds, arranging the living room furniture, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the words over and over, analyzing every nuance, every possible meaning, every subtle cruelty embedded in her handwriting. Each sentence of the will seemed to echo decades of judgment, yet as much as it hurt, it also forced me to see her as she truly was: a woman whose love had always been measured, transactional, and incomplete. I thought about the relatives who had been granted sums of money, properties, jewelry, luxuries that I had never received, and the wave of resentment rose in me like a tide I could not hold back. It was not fair. It was not just. And yet I realized that fairness had never been her concern, and expecting it now was naive. I went through my old photos, pictures of her holding me as a child, smiling, yet always distant, always evaluating. I remembered moments I had long buried, the afternoons I had sought her praise and been met with silence, the time she had compared me to my cousins, the way she had corrected my manners in front of company, the casual dismissals that had shaped my understanding of worth. These memories collided with the sting of the will, and I felt a cold clarity settle in my chest. This was her life, her rules, her legacy, and it was not my responsibility to carry it, to fix it, or to be defined by it. For years, I had sought her approval, had tried to mold myself to her expectations, had sacrificed pieces of my identity to earn a fraction of affection that was never fully granted. And yet now, holding her final judgment in my hands, I saw that approval would never be enough, and that the true act of survival was choosing myself over the recognition of someone who could not see me fully. I left the photos on the table and stepped outside. The sun was rising, cutting sharp lines of light across the garden, illuminating the dew on the grass, sparkling in a way that felt almost mocking in contrast to the heaviness in my heart. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from the neighbors' hedges, a small reminder that life outside of this house continued with an indifferent rhythm. I walked slowly along the stone path, letting the sunlight warm my face, feeling the solid earth beneath my feet, grounding me in the present, reminding me that I still had a body, a mind, and a life to claim. I could not undo the past, nor could I rewrite my mother's choices, but I could choose how to respond to them, and for the first time, I felt the stirrings of genuine agency, a sense of power that did not rely on her approval or anyone else's for that matter. By mid-morning, I decided I had to confront the practicalities of the will. I called the solicitor, trying to maintain composure as the receptionist explained the process, the inheritance, and the distribution of assets. Each sentence she uttered confirmed what I had suspected. I had been deliberately slighted, left with token amounts, overlooked in favor of others who, by any measure, had contributed little to her life. The anger flared again, but I let it flow through me like a current, acknowledging it, accepting it, then channeling it toward a decision. I would not allow this insult to fester into self-doubt. I would not give anyone, not even my mother in her absence, the power to dictate my value. This would be the moment where I stopped measuring myself by what was given to me, and instead defined my own worth. Later, I wandered through the rooms she had left behind, empty now except for her furniture and faint traces of her life, the lingering scent of her perfume, the careful organization of her books and keepsakes. I picked up a photograph of her as a young woman, standing proud in a garden, her expression both confident and unreadable. I wondered about her youth, her choices, her dreams, and the ways in which she had become the woman who could so coldly judge those closest to her. And then, almost without warning, I felt pity, not for myself but for her, the child she had once been, the woman she had tried to mold, and the limits of her capacity to give unconditional love. It was a strange, quiet release, this simultaneous anger and pity, and it allowed me a measure of peace even amidst the sting of insult. By the afternoon, I was ready to leave the house. I packed a small bag, deciding to take a walk in the city, to immerse myself in life outside the walls of this inheritance, outside the carefully curated space that had both nurtured and constrained me. On the streets, the world moved in its usual chaotic rhythm. Cars honking, people laughing, vendors shouting prices, the faint aroma of baked bread wafting from the nearby bakery. I found a bench and sat, letting the sounds, smells, and movement wash over me. I watched families pass, couples walking hand in hand, children chasing pigeons, and I felt a pang of longing mixed with resolve. I wanted connection, yes, but I would no longer seek it from people who measured me by a standard I could never meet. I would define my own relationships, my own sense of belonging, and my own path forward. Hours passed. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the pavement, turning everything golden and elongated. I realized I hadn't eaten, hadn't thought about food or comfort, because my mind was occupied with a new kind of planning. I would reclaim my life, piece by piece, decision by decision. This insult, the sting of being undervalued, would not be the end of my story. It would be the spark that ignited the life I had been too cautious to claim. I imagined possibilities. Career changes, friendships that honored me, personal projects, experiences I had denied myself, and a sense of freedom that had long been absent. Each image in my mind, vivid and expansive, gave me courage, a sense of purpose I had not felt in decades. When I returned home, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves had shifted, allowing space for a new energy. I placed the will on the table, a symbol of the past I was ready to release. And then I noticed something I had overlooked earlier. A small envelope tucked inside the larger one with my name in delicate handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single key and a note in my mother's elegant script. The words were brief but startling. For the life you deserve, not the one I chose for you. I stared at the key, my mind racing. What did she mean? What life had she intended for me to claim? Was this a gesture of redemption, of insight too late to matter, or an invitation to explore a path she could not take herself? I felt a surge of curiosity, fear, and determination all at once. The insult of the will had been sharp, but this key suggested possibility. A door, literal or metaphorical, that I had yet to open. And I knew instinctively that whatever lay behind it would change everything. The evening deepened, shadows folding into one another, the city outside buzzing softly with life. I held the key in my hand, turning it over, feeling the cool metal, imagining locks and doors, thresholds and transitions. I realized that my journey was only beginning. The past had shaped me, yes, but the future was unclaimed, open, and waiting for me to step into it fully. And with that realization came a strange thrill, a trembling anticipation of discovery, of challenge, and of reclaiming power that had been denied to me for far too long. I placed the key beside the will and sat in silence, letting the weight and promise of the day settle in. There would be obstacles. There would be confrontation. There would be moments of doubt and fear. But I understood now that the story I had been living, one of seeking validation and grappling with neglect, was no longer my only option. I could redefine it. I could reclaim it. And perhaps in stepping through the door this key represented, I would finally find the sense of freedom, dignity, and fulfillment that had been denied to me for so long. A knock at the door startled me, echoing in the quiet house. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart raced. When I opened it, a figure stood there, shadowed and mysterious, holding something I couldn't immediately identify. I felt a pulse of anticipation and fear intertwine, knowing instinctively that whatever this was would set the next chapter of my life into motion. And in that moment, I understood that the insult of the will, the sting of neglect, and the small, unexpected gesture of a key were all pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to solve. The figure at the door held out a small, leather-bound journal, the edges worn and the spine cracked from years of use. My hands shook as I took it, feeling the weight of it in my palms, and immediately a sense of anticipation, fear, and curiosity surged through me. Who had sent this? How had it been hidden for so long? And more importantly, what truths would it reveal about my mother, the life she lived, and perhaps the choices she had never shared with anyone? I carried the journal to the living room, my footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors. The house felt unusually quiet, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for me to open the pages. I sat down on the worn armchair by the window, the key and the will still lying on the table, symbols of past grievances and future possibilities, and prepared myself to read. The first pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, flowing sentences that seemed almost reflective, like a private confession or a secret she had been carrying for decades. The words painted a picture of a life I had never known. A life full of struggles, regrets, moments of tenderness and weakness, as well as a profound desire to control the world around her, including me. My mother had always been enigmatic, a presence both commanding and distant, and now in these pages she revealed a vulnerability I had never witnessed firsthand. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see her humanized in such an intimate way, stripped of the aura of perfection I had always assumed she carried. As I read further, I discovered references to her own upbringing, to hardships that had shaped her, and to choices she had made that had, in turn, influenced the way she treated those closest to her. There were admissions of mistakes, some small and some that felt monumental, and a recurring theme of fear. Fear of being judged, fear of failure, fear of losing control over her environment and the people she loved in ways she could not fully express. It was as if the journal was a bridge, offering me a glimpse into the complex landscape of her mind, showing me that the sting of her neglect was not born solely from malice, but also from a lifetime of unresolved pain and limitation. I paused at a page where she wrote about me directly, the sentences deliberate, careful, and tinged with an almost uncharacteristic tenderness. She acknowledged my resilience, my strength, and the ways in which I had navigated the constraints she imposed. Yet even in recognition, there was a shadow of regret, an acknowledgement that she had failed to express the love I needed in the ways I deserved. I felt a complex mix of emotions, anger, grief, relief, and a flicker of understanding. It was as though she were speaking to me across the years, offering both a confession and an apology that had been too late to change the past but was still powerful in its revelation. Hours passed as I turned each page carefully, savoring the language and the insights it offered. The journal revealed her fears about my life, the ways she had judged me unfairly, and the moments where she had tried, in her own flawed manner, to provide guidance or protection. There were mentions of people I had never met, places I had never been, and decisions she had made that had indirectly shaped my own path. The narrative was full of contradictions, moments of warmth and cruelty intertwined, a testament to the complexity of her character and the ways in which human beings can be both loving and flawed simultaneously. As the sun began to set, casting warm amber light across the room, I realized that the initial sting of the will had shifted into something more nuanced. The journal did not erase the insult, nor did it absolve the pain I had endured, but it provided context, a lens through which I could view my mother not as an idealized figure or a villain, but as a person who had lived imperfectly, struggled imperfectly, and left behind both hurt and wisdom in equal measure. I felt a strange relief in understanding her motivations, her limitations, and the contradictions that had defined her life. Yet even as this understanding settled over me, a new question arose. What was the significance of the key? The journal hinted at it indirectly with references to a hidden space, a private retreat she had maintained for decades, a room she described as a sanctuary for reflection, creativity, and decisions that required solitude. It was not a place of material wealth but of personal meaning, a repository of memories, secrets, and intentions she had deemed too precious or sensitive to share openly. My heart pounded as I realized that this key might unlock far more than a physical door. It could open access to a part of her life that had been invisible, secret, and deeply revealing. The air in the room thickened with anticipation as I rose, holding the journal in one hand and the key in the other. The house seemed charged with energy, every shadow and flicker of light emphasizing the tension between past grievances and the potential for discovery. I approached the door at the end of the hallway, the one that seemed most likely to house whatever secret she had referenced in the journal. My fingers trembled as I inserted the key into the lock, the metal cool and unforgiving against my skin, and I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism click in a way that resonated deep within me. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with items I could never have anticipated. There were stacks of old letters, photographs, personal mementos, and journals, each one carefully catalogued and preserved. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding texts that ranged from philosophy and literature to personal diaries and sketches. The air smelled faintly of lavender and aged paper, and a soft golden light filtered through a small window, casting intricate patterns across the floor. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling as though I had entered a sacred space, a private world my mother had created for herself, one that had been hidden from everyone, including me, for decades. I began to explore the room, touching the spines of books, leafing through photographs, and scanning letters that had been carefully tied with ribbons. Each item carried a story, a piece of her history, a clue to understanding the woman who had both nurtured and constrained me. There were photographs of her as a young adult, traveling, laughing with friends, and standing alone in reflective moments, capturing expressions of joy, uncertainty, and determination. Letters addressed to friends and distant relatives revealed the depth of her relationships, her regrets, her joys, and the weight of decisions that had shaped her life and indirectly mine. As I continued to examine the contents, I discovered a small locked box, the key to which was tucked into a corner of the room. My hands shook as I retrieved it, aware that whatever lay inside could redefine everything I thought I knew about her and, by extension, myself. I carefully opened the box, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and objects that suggested a hidden layer of her life, one filled with choices, sacrifices, and intentions that had been invisible to me until now. There was a letter addressed specifically to me, written in the same meticulous script, urging me to consider the life I wanted rather than the life she had envisioned, encouraging me to break free from the constraints of expectation, judgment, and inherited patterns. I sat on the floor, surrounded by her personal history, overwhelmed by the realization that the woman who had insulted me in her will had also left behind a roadmap for self-discovery and autonomy. The contradictions were striking, the emotional complexity profound, and I understood that my journey was far from over. The room, the key, the journals, and the letter represented not only a physical inheritance but an invitation to explore, challenge, and ultimately reclaim the parts of myself that had been suppressed, undervalued, or dismissed for far too long. As darkness settled outside, I closed the journal, clutched the key, and read the letter once more. The words resonated with a new urgency. The past could no longer define me. The future was mine to claim. I realized that the insult of the will had been the spark that ignited this exploration, and that every ounce of pain I had endured was now the fuel for my growth. The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls holding the echoes of a life fully lived, a life that had shaped me, challenged me, and now, finally, offered the possibility of transformation. A sudden knock at the front door startled me, echoing through the house. My pulse quickened. I wasn't expecting anyone, and yet instinct told me that this moment would mark the beginning of another chapter, one that would push me further into uncharted territory, reveal hidden truths, and test my resolve. I glanced at the journal, the key, and the letter, feeling a mixture of fear, anticipation, and determination. Whatever awaited me beyond that door, I knew that I was no longer the passive, seeking child of the woman who had insulted me. I was ready to step into my own power, claim my own story, and confront the truths, challenges, and revelations that had been waiting for me all along. The knock at the door still echoed in my ears, sharp and insistent, breaking the fragile quiet that had settled over the house. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart racing, my mind swirling with questions and possibilities. Who could it be at this hour, and why did it feel as if their arrival was somehow tied to the key, the journal, and the hidden room I had just discovered? Each step I took toward the door felt heavy, weighted with anticipation, yet driven by an irresistible pull toward discovery. I paused, hand hovering over the doorknob, inhaling the cool evening air that had crept in through the slightly open window. The city outside had taken on a quiet hush, the usual hum of traffic and distant voices muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. When I opened the door, a figure stood there, tall, shadowed, their features obscured by the dim light of the porch. In their hand was a small package, neatly wrapped and sealed with a wax stamp. I could feel the weight of their gaze, assessing me with an intensity that made me instinctively straighten my posture, despite the tremor that ran through my body. The stranger spoke, their voice calm yet firm, telling me that what they held was something my mother had entrusted to them long ago, something that could only be given to me now. I accepted the package without hesitation, my curiosity overpowering any fear. Inside was a second journal, smaller than the first, its leather cover soft and worn, carrying the unmistakable scent of old paper and ink. I ran my fingers over the spine, feeling the grooves and imperfections, as if each mark were a clue left deliberately for me to uncover. The first pages contained nothing but dates and brief notations, like a calendar of moments my mother had deemed significant. But as I turned the pages, the entries became longer, more intimate, revealing layers of her life that I had never imagined. There were confessions of mistakes, of regrets, of moments of tenderness that she had never expressed aloud, and even cryptic notes about decisions she had made regarding her family, her wealth, and her relationships. As I read, I realized that my mother had kept a meticulous record of her perceptions of me, her judgments, and even her hopes. Some passages were painful to read, exposing the ways she had misunderstood me, overlooked my struggles, and imposed her expectations. Yet there were also lines that hinted at recognition, admiration, and an acknowledgement of my resilience. Each word was a thread connecting me to her mind, and yet, paradoxically, it made me feel both closer to her and further away than I had ever felt in my life. I could see the complexity of her motives, the contradictions in her character, and the depth of her inability to express unconditional love, all while maintaining an air of control and propriety. Hours passed as I absorbed the contents, my mind weaving between memories of my childhood and the revelations of the journals. I thought about the insults embedded in the will, the sting of being undervalued, and the deliberate choices she had made that had shaped my understanding of myself and my place in the family. And yet, despite the pain, I felt a shift within me, a burgeoning sense of agency and insight. The journals revealed not only her flaws but also the opportunities she had unknowingly left for me to claim, the small openings through which I could navigate towards self-definition, autonomy, and reclamation of power. As night fell, the house took on an almost sacred quality, shadows stretching across the walls, light from the street lamps spilling through the windows, illuminating the edges of the furniture and the scattered papers on the floor. I felt a strange combination of fear and exhilaration, as if I had stepped into a liminal space between the past and the future, a threshold that demanded courage and clarity. I realized that the journey my mother had inadvertently set before me was not about wealth, inheritance, or approval, but about understanding, confronting, and ultimately redefining my own life in the wake of her absence. I set the journal aside and allowed myself to breathe, the tension in my chest easing slightly, replaced by a quiet determination. I could no longer allow her judgments, whether explicit or implicit, to dictate my sense of worth. I could no longer measure myself by what she had chosen to give or withhold. The key, the journals, and the hidden room were not just physical objects. They were symbols of the power she had left behind unintentionally, a map for reclaiming my life, my autonomy, and my identity. Just as I began to feel a fragile sense of peace, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from an unknown number, a single line of text. "You're closer than you think. Be careful who you trust." My heart skipped a beat and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I realized then that my mother's past, her secrets, and her final gestures were entangled with forces and people I had not yet encountered, and that the journey she had initiated for me was far from straightforward. The stakes were higher than I had imagined, and the questions that had begun to form in my mind demanded answers that could only be found through courage, persistence, and careful navigation. The night deepened, shadows merging into darkness, and I felt both the weight of history and the pull of possibility. I understood that I was standing at the intersection of pain and empowerment, of insult and revelation, of the past I had inherited and the future I could claim. The key rested in my hand, the journals lay open before me, and the unknown message lingered in my thoughts. Every element pointed toward a single truth. The next steps I took would determine not only how I understood my mother, but also how I would define myself, beyond her judgments, beyond her expectations, and beyond the sting of the will. A sudden sound from the hallway made me freeze. A soft creak, the subtle shifting of floorboards as if someone else was in the house. My pulse quickened, and I felt the familiar blend of fear and anticipation that had accompanied every new discovery since opening the will. I gripped the key tightly, rose from the chair, and moved toward the source of the sound, each step measured, every sense alert. The shadows seemed to thicken around me, stretching and twisting with the flicker of the lamp overhead. And then, just beyond the doorway, I saw a glimpse of movement, a figure half hidden, and I realized that my mother's secrets were not entirely confined to paper. They had been guarded, perhaps even manipulated, by someone still very much present in the world of the living. I held my breath, my body tense, my mind racing with questions. Who had followed these instructions? Who had hidden this journal? And what did they expect from me? The answers, I knew, would not come easily, and yet, deep within, I felt the same resolve that had carried me through the sting of the will, the discovery of the hidden room, and the revelations of the first journal. I was ready to confront whatever, or whoever, stood in the shadows, to uncover truths that had been deliberately obscured, and to claim the autonomy that had been denied to me for so long. And then a voice, low and deliberate, broke the silence. "I've been waiting for you to find this. Now it begins." The voice lingered in the hallway, low and deliberate, carrying with it a weight that pressed against my chest and forced my heart into a frantic rhythm. I stood frozen, clutching the key in one hand, the journal in the other, as though these objects could protect me from the unknown presence. My mind raced, analyzing every possibility, recalling every story I had ever been told about hidden family secrets, inheritance disputes, and the invisible threads that connected past actions to present consequences. The shadows of the house seemed to stretch, fold, and shift, creating a landscape of uncertainty that mirrored the turbulence in my chest. I knew instinctively that whatever had been waiting for me had been orchestrated for years, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. Stepping cautiously toward the figure, I tried to gauge the details, the shape, the posture, but the dim light played tricks on my eyes. My mother's journals and the hidden room had prepared me, perhaps, for revelations, but not for confrontation. The voice spoke again, this time slightly warmer, though still carrying an authority that demanded attention. It revealed that the journals, the key, and the hidden room were never meant solely as gifts. They were tests, guides, and invitations. An intricate path had been left for me, crafted with intention, designed to lead me to a point of understanding both my mother's life and my own potential. Every insult in the will, every slight I had endured, had been a deliberate shaping of character, a challenge to navigate the complex web of expectations, disappointments, and secrets that had defined her world. I felt a surge of anger mingled with grief and a strange sense of awe. For years I had blamed her, resented her, and mourned the absence of unconditional love. Yet now I understood that even her cruelty had been intertwined with a desire to prepare me, perhaps clumsily, for the life I was now being asked to claim. The realization hit me with both force and clarity. My mother's absence, the sting of the will, and the secrecy of her private world were all threads woven into a tapestry meant to challenge me, and perhaps to empower me in ways she could never articulate in life. The figure stepped closer, and I saw them fully for the first time. A woman, perhaps a friend of my mother's, her face a reflection of determination and recognition. She extended a hand, not in threat, but as an invitation, as if offering passage into a deeper layer of understanding. I hesitated, the weight of the past heavy on my shoulders, the memory of years spent navigating neglect and judgment pressing against my resolve. But the pull of curiosity, the drive to reclaim agency, and the need to understand the woman who had shaped me in such conflicting ways overcame my fear. I took her hand, and she guided me toward a small, concealed door at the far end of the hallway, one that had not been mentioned in the journals, one that even the key did not seem to correspond to directly. Inside was a room that defied expectation. It was a space of reflection, creation, and hidden generosity, filled with photographs, letters, and objects my mother had collected over decades. There were meticulous records of her life, her ambitions, and her regrets, alongside personal items meant to be gifts, tokens, and instructions for someone who could understand their value. I moved through the space slowly, reverently, touching the spines of books, the edges of photographs, and the surfaces of objects that held significance I could barely comprehend. The room smelled faintly of sandalwood and aged paper, a scent that seemed to anchor me to both the past and the possibilities of the future. The woman gestured to a small desk at the corner of the room, upon which lay a sealed envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up, breaking the seal with care. Inside were instructions detailed, precise, and intimate, revealing a map not of wealth, but of wisdom, self-realization, and autonomy. She had left me guidance on how to navigate relationships, finances, personal growth, and understanding the patterns that had shaped our family. There were letters from distant relatives, notes of gratitude, apologies, and accounts of moments she had feared to share with anyone. Every page, every word, carried a sense of deliberate intention, as though she had meticulously orchestrated a way for me to reclaim power, insight, and agency long after she was gone. As I absorbed the contents, I realized that the journey I had embarked upon was more than inheritance. It was transformation. The sting of the will, once sharp and defining, had become the catalyst for something profound, an awakening to my own capacity to define worth, to navigate challenges, and to embrace life with clarity and purpose. I understood that my mother's failures, her misjudgments, and her omissions had all been part of a larger narrative, one that now placed me at the center, empowered and accountable for my own destiny. The evening deepened, and the city beyond the windows seemed to glow faintly with life, distant voices and lights mingling with the quiet of the house. I felt a trembling anticipation of what I might do next, a realization that the choices before me were now my own, unrestricted by the judgments, limitations, or neglect of the past. And yet, even with this newfound clarity, a sense of curiosity and unease persisted. The message from earlier lingered in my mind: "You're closer than you think. Be careful who you trust." I understood that my mother's final act was not only about revelation, but also about vigilance, discernment, and navigating the hidden layers of intention left by those who had influenced her life. I sat in the room for hours, reading, reflecting, and planning. The journals, the key, and the hidden spaces were no longer symbols of insult. They were instruments of empowerment, guiding me toward a life I had long been denied the chance to define. I felt a mixture of sorrow, liberation, and determination, knowing that the path forward would require courage, intelligence, and emotional resilience. The weight of past grievances had transformed into fuel for self-assertion, and the insights gleaned from my mother's meticulous documentation had given me tools to navigate a future unbound by old patterns. As midnight approached, a quiet tension settled over the house. The woman who had delivered the second journal remained at a distance, silent but present, allowing me space to process and decide. I realized that the journey was far from complete. The documents, the hidden room, and the objects were not endpoints but starting points. There would be challenges, confrontations, and decisions that demanded reflection and courage. And yet, for the first time in my life, I felt fully prepared to face them, equipped with understanding, awareness, and a sense of personal authority that had long been denied to me. I gathered the journals, the key, and the letters, placing them carefully into a bag I had brought for this purpose. The woman approached once more, her eyes reflecting both approval and a quiet acknowledgement that the work ahead would test me in ways both familiar and unprecedented. I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and resolve, understanding that the journey of reclamation was now mine to navigate fully. The house seemed to exhale around me as though releasing the tension of decades, and the city outside glimmered with possibility, a world waiting for me to step forward and claim it. And then, as I turned to leave the hidden room, I noticed a final envelope, smaller, almost imperceptible, tucked behind a stack of letters. My pulse quickened as I picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, but the contents were unreadable from the outside, the envelope sealed with a wax stamp I had not seen before. A shiver ran through me as I realized that even after all the revelations, the keys, the journals, and the letters, there remained one last mystery, a secret she had reserved for this precise moment, meant to challenge me, intrigue me, and propel me further along a path I had only begun to explore. I held the envelope tightly, feeling the weight of her final intention, knowing that whatever lay inside would demand courage, insight, and perhaps even a confrontation with truths I was not yet ready to face. Yet the anticipation was intoxicating, a blend of fear, excitement, and the undeniable pull of destiny. I understood that my mother's life, her will, and her secrets were more than a narrative of neglect. They were a series of invitations, carefully orchestrated challenges, and opportunities for growth, and that this final envelope represented the next threshold. With trembling hands, I tucked it into my bag, resolved to face whatever revelations awaited. The house was silent, the city asleep, and yet I felt a pulse of energy, a charge that seemed to flow from the past into the present, urging me to step boldly into the future. I had survived insult, neglect, and the weight of family expectations. I had discovered hidden rooms, journals, and guidance I had never imagined. And now, with the final envelope in my possession, I felt that I stood on the brink of something transformative, a truth that would redefine my understanding of my mother, my family, and most importantly, myself. The night stretched infinitely, a quiet canvas of possibility. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs with anticipation, and stepped toward the door, the journals and the envelope secured. I understood that the story was not over, that the journey of discovery and self-assertion would continue, and that the lessons, insights, and mysteries left by my mother would shape every step I took. And as I closed the door behind me, I felt a surge of clarity and determination, knowing that the past, the insult, and the secrets were now fuel for a life I would define entirely on my own terms, with courage, wisdom, and the curiosity that would carry me into the unknown. Please follow me for no reason.